てきて、そうすると例えば水彩画みたいなものをCG で人間が描いてるように表現するっていうことっていうのが多分5年後とか10年後ぐらいには少なくともきっとできるだろうっていう
So OpenAI has made this ghiblifying thing, some image generating monstrosity that turns your photos into something that vaguely looks like Studio Ghibli. Wow, it's so magical. I'm sure they got permission to be using their brand association for this promo campaign for their slop. I'm sure that absolutely happened. And this has been divisive, especially in Japan, with anime directors saying it was complete disrespect for them to do that to Miyazaki, most likely through stealing every frame from Studio Ghibli's films. But it has been quite popular with the general population who see it basically like, oh, it's cool, it's like a TikTok filter, which, yeah, it's pretty close. Basically works the way, it's not particularly that fancy or advanced. Yeah, the eyes are melting the closer you go, the eyelashes are bad. You still can't do fingers, and even emotions, it doesn't seem to register them very well. Like, this distracted boyfriend, whatever this is, old meme thing, that's not the smoldering face, that's not like the face he pulls off. This is kind of like wimpy annoyed face. It's not the same emotion. Sure, when you're smiling or maybe making like a happy response, it can kind of do that, but when it goes to something that's a bit more nuanced, it loses its ability. Say for example, backgrounds, it doesn't really know what it's doing with those. People in the background tend to melt, and other pieces of background don't make much sense, even though they have a reference. It's not perfect. It's the same as pretty much any of these other AI things. On the topic of stealing though, there was an AI whistleblower from OpenAI who came out last year to the New Yorker and said, yes, the company is stealing stuff. And the way they do it through the program, making visual copies of stuff, putting them in the system, and in theory they're supposed to make some sort of new out of them, but that's not always the case of how it works. So it's all a bit dubious. And OpenAI is currently fighting many legal ramification lawsuits in the process of all this. But the real kicker that's probably started this, and maybe the reason that OpenAI even did this, if they were being really petty, is a classic clip of Hayao Miyazaki talking about his complete distaste for AI. But this was happening in 2016 when it was more of a speculative assumption that in 10 years this technology would exist. His first response to it being like, well, you won't need people then if you have this program, so I don't know why you're coming to me. But there's a classic little clip in here where he talks about it being an insult to life itself, which technically isn't about the program itself. It's more about what he's been showing on a projector, which is some sort of hypothetical. I don't know why they're showing him like a bad 3D model running against the floor. They've got such a terrible response that they probably should have just ended the pitch there. But when they did ask about the actual program of making your robots be able to draw, Miyazaki just responded with a quiet, dead stare, leading into him saying, which is pretty funny. Now this documentary is from The Neverending Man in 2016, and it was sort of the behind-the-scenes production of Borrow the Caterpillar, which was Miyazaki's attempt at doing some CG 3D animation alongside 2D stuff and sort of merging those worlds. But I believe as this AI conversation, the way the documentary takes it is that he sees himself as running away from animation, and 2D animation specifically, which is where he's at. And that even if it's hard, even if it's laborious, even if it takes a lot of energy and difficulty, that's why it's worth it. As he reassesses his dedication to basically hand-drawn animation and then going on to start the production of The Boy and the Heron. And that in some part that, the artistic value in it is that it's not easy to make a film like this. It's actually really difficult and takes a lot of skill and time. Look, a machine that can pop out some vague assimilation of it in 3 minutes or less is not really giving the same effect. Now that is a movie that is basically in the hands of creatives. It was not funded by a production committee of big, important $1 million companies. It was all sort of funded in-house, which meant it could do things a little bit more unorthodox in terms of having a longer production and do things at their own pace, better working conditions. And that is not what OpenAI wants. My biggest concern about them is how they are using this tool. And there's more to this tool than just the ghiblifying. There's a whole breakdown of what they would like to be able to do with this tool in terms of graphic design, small comics, illustrations, consistency with prompt add-ons. All these programs seem to be pushing themselves more into the sort of creative business sector and showing like, oh, look at the potential we have, that if you buy our systems, you could use it to make graphic design without having to use people, besides maybe to clean up the mess in the end. Look, it can do type now, kind of, sometimes. Not that language, though. It's not looking encouraging for those industries. And even pitching what seems to be diagrams to government funding. Look, we could use it in schools, which I don't know if you should trust it to give the right information, since it tends to be wrong 50% of the time, but I digress. A lot of this is concerning for the creative workforce and how it deteriorates the worth and value of their work, as well as the worst possible case scenario being that they end up downsizing their entire creative department to the people who clean up the slop and make it feasible to show to people. And how effective that pitch is going to be in terms of actually working out, I don't know. I mean, it seems that they've already ran into problems with this Ghibli filter in terms of, I had heard that effectively a lot of people, especially on the free service, were being told that they can't make Ghiblifying images anymore because it breaks their content rules. Some people seem to still be able to do it. I don't know if it's just the paid ones, but I tried it myself. I gave an example here. I was like, oh, okay, I'll give this picture of Ocean Mad Drip, tell it to Ghiblify it and see if it does it. And it did not. It told me no twice. So I don't know if there was behind the scenes conversation or things have got a bit too hot, but it doesn't seem consistent, the system. Now, there are also some complications that come with such a system. So this borderline filter seems to have kind of blown out OpenAI's GPUs. They said melting. That might be a joke. So they had to very quickly limit the amount of people being able to use it, which to me makes me wonder how effective these programs are to begin with if it takes so much to do so little. Not to mention, there's also the problem of inbreeding AI, which has been something that's been talked about quite a lot in the last year, in that like they can't differentiate the difference between a real image and an AI image. So the AI images go back into the system and the results they get in the end become worse and worse and worse, and they become more homogenized and broken. Now, will this be a problem forever? Probably not. Eventually they may be able to figure a way out telling the system like what is AI and what is not. Although how long that's going to take, nobody knows. And by the time they figure it out, all that speculative investor money might be gone. In the words of Miyazaki, maybe AI was a mistake. It kind of feels like we're dealing with snake oil salesmen in some way. They have big aspirations, but can they make it work? I don't know. And there's still some of this in the rest of the anime industry as well, unfortunately. So for example, YouTuber Dong Chang. He has been pretty well known in the sort of anime art sort of newbie area as doing tutorials and how you can do certain things, and you know, how you make a layout in anime. This is the program they use in anime. This is how you do this. This is how you do this. Stuff that's pretty helpful for young animators. But also now he is basically peddling some sort of weird AI in between cleanup coloring device that's only on his website. There's not a lot of details about it. But I think the audience was very mixed on the response, because the top comment is still an in-betweener saying this kind of device will destroy the industry that's already struggling when it comes to in-betweeners. And these programs do exist in the industry. It's not like this is the first time they have. His is supposed to be more advanced, quote. I don't really understand if it is. It's apparently some people in the comments are saying that you have to pay $2 per in-between. So I don't even see how, like, who the hell, who's going to be using this? Like, it seems like they're trying to peddle it to studios, but the output it gives, it's not very good. Like the in-betweens, the final animation that it's throwing out, very janky. Yes, these programs could get better, but if they did, then effectively, well, you're out of the business, aren't you? Because as soon as they get good enough to make a competent in-betweens, they don't need key animators anymore. That's just the facts of it. And I don't know if they'll ever technically get to that point. Like these programs, if they are used, the biggest problem is that it's an art, not a science. Spacing, even when you give them a chart or whatever he's saying you can do, you're not going to get a perfect result because you may have a different preference of what you want. And when it comes to more complicated moves, it's not really going to be able to simulate the animation properly, because maybe it can do just fine with, like, I don't know, a head turn when it's got the frames, or walking down a road really still. But when it comes to more complicated things like dancing or fight scenes, it's going to give some really weird results. And it's going to effectively mean that there's just going to be a hell of a lot of more work for the people next up the cubicle, in terms of people like the animation directors who may have to look at this and go, this is just complete dog. I need to redraw the whole thing, which is just more work for them. In the end, the result you're going to get is going to be pretty limited and bad, a cleanup of a terrible AI image. And when we see people pitching this idea, like a certain anime AI movie, which is supposedly, allegedly 95% AI generated, like their version of the AI, in terms of taking the frames and then sort of filling them in, creates a lot of really weird problems, which is going to take ages for a real animator to clean up. And the results, again, at the end, don't look very good because the spacing is weird. And spacing is hard, even for real people. It's so difficult. Like, I'm not going to pretend I'm any good at it. Like, I once upon a time did try and do a Ghibli animation in the style of Ghibli. You know, I did it on the pencils. I did some backgrounds for it. I gave it a go. I don't know if it worked 100%. I don't know if it really has the vibe 100 there, but it's a learning process. It's something you can build on. And in theory, when it comes to the anime industry, that's the goal. You can't just get rid of in-betweeners. This is the core, well, ideally, this is the cornerstone of which you teach the next generation. This is where you're supposed to start in the animation field. You learn from masters, you learn from like your tutors, and they teach you, and they teach you the ways, and you learn tricks and trades, and you learn how to animate properly, and then you move up the scale, and then new Dogen people come in, and that kind of vibe. That's what's supposed to happen, ideally. Maybe some people will stay, depending on their income, which usually isn't very good, which, look, the industry when it comes to in-betweeners is in a complete nightmare state, but this is only going to topple it ever further. And that's not to say there can't be some kind of program in the middle here. I mean, there are things that do like micro tweening. Usually you can do that on like Adobe Animate or whatever, where, you know, you turn the line work into a shape and you can transition each shape into each other. And people like Yuasa quite like that. They add that to their sort of key animation in-betweens. It's something that enhances, or quote enhances it. It depends if you like that style. I'm not massive on the sort of more like waviness, but there are definitely utilities for it. And I can see why someone might want to do something like that. And look, yeah, like I said, the in-between industry is not in a good place, and it hasn't been for a long time. There were jokes 20 years ago in animation running Kuromi that all the in-betweeners in a lot of the departments in different studios in Japan had quit because, you know, it's too much work, the pay's really bad, and they'd all been moved and outsourced overseas. In fact, Ghibli is probably one of the few places when it was operational where you would find in-betweeners in-house doing most of the work, or at the very least keeping all the in-betweening within, you know, the Tokyo space. Because in Ghibli, the ideal of it was that those in-betweeners were taught by one of the veterans like Kondo, and they worked their way up the ladder if they wanted to. Say, for example, someone like Yanabayashi. Yanabayashi ended up starting as an in-betweener, working on lots of little projects there, moving to being a key animator by Spirited Away, eventually became a animation supervisor director, as they call them in Ghibli, and eventually a director at the studio with Ariete, because Suzuki said, quote, he's basically our best animator. And that wouldn't have been possible if they didn't have that system in mind. And hell, I've actually talked to a different in-betweener who spent some time at Ghibli. He effectively told me that he learnt more at Ghibli, working there for about a year or so, than he did at one of France's most prestigious animation colleges for 3 years. Even if this program gets better and they can spit out backgrounds that are effective and good enough in terms of all these processes, you are going to be losing something in the process, because it's not just enough to have some sort of homogenized prompt-based system. You know, you want something from France? Well, here you go. That system's going to give you what it thinks generally people see as France, what images it's found that look like France. There's an importance in going and scouting these places, taking photos yourself, doing research, thinking about what the intent is, what color palettes you want, how you want things to look, what sort of vibe you're looking for, like going through the history books. Figure out the world you're creating instead of letting some sort of automated system give you something that's, okay, looks all right. And on that process involves a lot of collaboration and refining and debates with different creators, but will make something that's more of a sum of its parts, a more defined project. And you're removing that all when you create an automated system that can do it in a couple minutes while destroying half the ocean. This whole thing just seems a little ludicrous to me. I mean, I'm going back to Mr. Starvey here and his perspective on AI within the arts.
How did fucking computers become the thing and machines became the thing that does art, and humans are the ones in fucking Amazon warehouses? Yeah. Like, shouldn't the robots be working so we could paint?
And I think a lot of times people who are very pro AI kind of see people who have their problems with it, you know, even if it's more about the technical side or the loss in wages, and go, oh, you know, Luddite, you know, you don't like technology, yada, yada, yada. Well, that's not really the case here. I feel like there's a lot of different technologies that can be used and can be effective for animation going forward, which also have more practicality than a system that barely works. You know, look at things like Blender. Blender has always been improving. It's free. It's for everyone. It just won an Oscar. Like, that's crazy. But like, there are programs in there, you know, there are 3D models you can draw on, there's the grease pencil, and all this other stuff that keeps building, and you can use, you know, you can use 3D models to do in-betweens. You know, it kind of can automate the process if we really want to. Now, it's a lot of extra work, I suppose, so it really depends on how dedicated you are to that. But I've seen people do pretty effective work with it. Looking at here, or even someone like Worthy Kids, who has absolutely mastered the position between 3D and 2D. Like this kind of animation here, Wizard Beer, that stuff is amazing. I don't know how he did that. It took me a while to even realize that most of those models were 3D. Outside of the parts were a little bit more complicated that are drawn in. But it's just that sort of marriage between the two. What about Moho Studios? That tool effectively lets you use vectorization to take a piece of art or drawing and put it through the system and vectorize it and make a version of it there, and you can move it on its own and adjust it and do things with it and sort of build it without necessarily having to draw every frame. And this is a program that has been used by Cartoon Saloon for years. And it's really effective, I suppose, for like big mechanical things that are actually quite hard to draw into perspective. And it's probably a little bit more efficient than using a 3D model for them. But that stuff has a lot of potential to go forward, a lot of very useful features, and they can be used in harmony with 2D animation. And look, if we're talking about Studio Ghibli, we should stop complaining about this and we should have a look into Cocoon, which is not fully out yet, but had a preview recently on NHK. This comes from one of the minds of Studio Ghibli for maybe 20 years. They retired a while back, but they were effectively in charge of the in-between department and cleanup and everything else. And they created their own studio, and through NHK, it seems basically just NHK, they have made this 1 hour animation very much in the Ghibli style, but it's a beautiful little film they made, and no AI needed. It could have been done without it. And speaking of other beautiful Ghibli-esque movies, what about Nasu and Summer of Andalusia? Use my code StephenNasu on AnimeAgo site to get 20% off. It's a lot better than whatever fucking AI trash you're gonna see on the internet. Oh yeah, and I've made a lot of videos about Ghibli in the past, their history, the drama, and a lot of interesting stories that don't often get told within this playlist. So if you want to hear about Ghibli and Ghibli's past and future, check those out. And I got to shout out my patrons. A big thank you to Lenny, Tim J. Richards, Chunks, Fox Mulder, OT, Paul, Steven's Mum, Subsofa, Systematic, Karen, Doji, Peter, Jaeger, Big Boss, DTB, Gambaroni, Aleph, Mickey Moon, Petro Ferreira, Waj, RG Palmer, Kitty Cat, Oscar Britton, Giorgio, Luga, Ian Laser, Curtis, Alexander, Pong, Mataisu, Axel, Sat. You're great, especially as well as the $5 patrons here. Thank you for keeping everything going and giving all the support you can. We'll be back to Oshi next time.